Before we get started, I just want to say thank you to GoToCon organizers. I have a 9-month-old little baby. She's there supporting mom. And we live in San Francisco, and I haven't really slept a single night without her. And the organizers kind of accommodated the 3 of us in the hotel and made it possible for me to be here. So thank you again. And to all the, and all the parents who left their children at home and traveled here, may the force be with you. Cool, let's get us started. The journey from legacy system to microservices is an epic one. And like any epic journey, it starts with a dream, and a belly in the fire in the belly, and a bit of a pain in the back. So for a lot of our clients, the pain they experience is that they're stuck. They can't change their systems, it costs too much, and it takes too long to make changes. So they dream about microservices so that they can either scale their operations, have many teams building features and capabilities for their growing market, or be able to experiment with their core capabilities. And by experimentation, I don't mean necessarily changing UI and do some sort of A/B testing to see how customers respond. Experimenting with their core business. If you're in a telco, or your product manager dreams of being able to bundle different offerings together and experiment with those. If you're in insurance industry, you want to try with different customer segments and policies for different risk factors. Or in retail or supply chain, you want to be able to try different routing algorithms to get the goods from warehouses to the stores. And it's really hard with legacy. So their journey starts with a courageous leader, take a leap of faith, and basically start with building services around the edges, somewhat fairly decoupled services, maybe some facade services in the digital world to face your mobile applications, and that pays off quickly. We can get some quick wins. But the dream doesn't get realized until she faces the monolith deep in the valley. And that's going to be a hard battle, because that's where she needs to kind of decouple core capabilities, the customer insights, customer information, the master product definition, so that she can experiment and change those more rapidly. And I have to be honest with you, this is a bloody battle. And we lose a lot of people along the way. The cost of the first service I recall for one of our clients was about $2 million. So they got kind of disheartened and quit the whole journey, but not her. Jen is not over yet. So the journey continues with an uphill push and a long climb of changing organization along the way and building the backbone delivery infrastructure so you can actually host and run the services. So this is where the protagonists of our story really get tested. But arriving, tasting the sweet arrival of getting a capability or asset unlocked, she will forget all the pain and do it over and over again. So just get a sense of the audience here. Who feel that they are kind of in that free fall? Not so much of a free fall, you have a parachute. Building services around the edges in the digital part of the corporation. Okay, a couple. Who are deep in the valley decoupling services from a monolith? Only 1, 2, 3, oh, okay, few people. Told you, it's a hard one. And who feel the kind of the climb of pushing the change through the organization? Few made it. Up the hill, okay, great. So it's going to be an action-packed talk, and I know it's the last talk on the day, during the day, but hopefully we can get through this together. I'm going to start with kind of overview of microservices. I have to apologize from people who have been sitting on this track. I feel like every other speaker, I felt compelled to give you a definition of microservices, but I'm going to promise it's going to be short and painless. I'm going to go through it quickly. And then we're going to talk about 7 kind of techniques that you can use for decoupling capabilities out of monolithic systems. And at the end, we're going to kind of come back and cover a bit of a breadth at a high level. What you can, I guess, the processes and approaches you can take to go the long way, to do the architectural evolution and go through the transition at the organizational level. All right, the dream. The dream of microservices ecosystem. If you realize, I kind of emphasize the word ecosystem quite a bit in my talk, because I feel we've moved on from microservices just being an architectural style of post-continuous delivery, and has evolved to be a way we organize our team, the way we allocate budgets, and the way we, the operational capabilities that we built. So a quick architectural evolution history. I'm going to be really, really quick. First the dinosaurs, then the monolith, then we got really smart with kind of intelligently integrated services with middleware. We got fascinated with N-tier web applications, where specialized hardware and software was designed for certain technical capabilities, web layer and application server for the business logic and database clusters to keep our data. And this is the point that we started kind of playing with the microservices. Usually, as I said, in the digital organization, the more nimble part of our organizations. We started building facade services that represent some of our capabilities, but if you look behind the scene, there was still a monolith, whether it was the database keeping the state, or it's still a legacy system keeping the behavior and entangling the services. And then we reached the peak of revolution of microservices. Well, we felt quite relieved, and we started building services, tiny services around business capabilities, and we, formed teams around the business capabilities and those services. Every team was completely autonomous and take care of the full stack of building and running their services. We started arguing how tiny these services need to be, and there were talks given on the size of the microservice. And though a lot of companies, I guess, benefited from this state of operation, we hear a lot of sad stories that companies who weren't really mature enough for operating this level of kind of autonomy, they really hurt. They felt a lot of friction between the teams to get anything working. They felt a lot of duplicate working costs occurring across the teams building the full stack support. And I feel what I see now in the industry is that we are maturing, and we are reaching a more, I guess, state of equilibrium with what I call microservices ecosystem on a platform. We are making an abstraction of our, the lower level of operation, as in our compute engine has its own services and APIs, whether you're running on Amazon or Google Cloud, you've seen that. Our data layer has its own APIs to use, and we're building a platform of API, and most importantly, self-serve kind of APIs exposed by these services. So we are removing those kind of high friction of using services or each other's services by introducing the product thinking and platform thinking, and I touch on this in a little while. So what are the fundamental characteristics? Microservices around business capabilities. I want to take this just a little bit further. When we started, I guess in my experience, when we started thinking about services, we had a very kind of data-centric. It's easy to think about RESTful resources as the data assets that we have, customers and orders and products. But what I want to encourage you to think about is kind of higher level of abstractions of your business capabilities. For instance, if you're working in retail, you have a store, probably an asset or resource that shows the stores, but you have a capability for a customer to be able to reserve an item that you bought online on store. So it's a higher level kind of business capability you can encapsulate, which would use another service like a store locator. There is a good insight article on Thoughtworks if you're interested around well-factored services where you can get the most ROI on your service refactoring. We talked about RESTful kind of smart endpoints, dumb pipes, using RESTful APIs for microservices. That's what happens when you bring your baby to the conference. She starts crying. So yes, so we use kind of this RESTful APIs as a fabric of integration. I want to take that one step further with kind of the maturity that we've seen over the last few years and using APIs for integration. We now look at APIs as products, and there is actually a good coverage of that on Tech Radar, where developers consuming the APIs get the same treatment that the end user would get using our mobile or applications or any other user-facing application. We apply the same user experience I guess, methodologies to developing our APIs, good documentation, for different personas of the developers consuming APIs, readability, accessibility, having a console so they can play. So we kind of take that a step further. And the most fundamental characteristic is that they can be released independently and teams being aligned around them. A lot of the speakers for this track already talked this one, so I kind of skipped through it. And finally, built on a self-served platform. So if you think about your operational stack, where you run your services, how you build them, deploy them, or orchestrate them, think about those capabilities also as APIs exposed in a self-service way to people who write the services. I remember once using shared services was almost a swear word when we started thinking about the microservices, but I think by moving to product thinking and self-serve aspect of shared services, that's no longer the case. Okay, I promised it was going to be fast. So are we ready for the battle? Good, let's do it. Number one, decouple the most constraining factor early, the not. I still need a good name for this, but let's go with the not for now. So basically, remember that free fall of the cliff? We started with kind of fairly already decoupled services. Usually the good candidate is, let's decouple our authentication or a couple of facade services, but not when you get to the monolith. You really want to go for the heart where the most offensive part of your code that makes everything else entangled. What do I mean by that? Let's give you an example. I can challenge you that if you are building web applications, you probably have a concept, a bunch of classes or a class that represents your web session. And session is a trap for all sorts of parameters around the user interaction that has been, the user interaction with the site when he or she has been authenticated. Session usually couples everything else in. We had, in one of our clients, we were decoupling, it's a retail system, we were decoupling different capabilities, and we kind of shied away with this session because nobody knows what it was in it, and every kind of other piece of code was using it. And that has stopped us to almost decouple anything else. We always went back, oh, we need to decouple session. And please do not create a session service somewhere in your topology because all you're doing, you're dragging out all those tight couplings that were in process, now out of process in a distributed system. We have done that. Don't do it. So create those domain, I guess, concepts that are hidden and trapped right now in the session. It's probably your customer interaction, probably an event log that represents your customer, that customer interaction, customer preferences, identity, authentication, and so on. And a tool that you can use to do that, you can use a structural analysis kind of tools to find these tightly coupled kind of God dependencies in your code. Okay, number 2, 6 more to go. Decouple capability, not code. So when we think about decoupling a monolith, we always quite biased towards the code we have written, and we feel it's just too precious to throw it away. But in my experience, we often underestimate how much it costs to reuse code. So the recommendation here is instead of reusing the code, re-implement the capability and retire the old code. The reason for that is because the code we have written has aged and kind of old assumptions around how it's going to run, where it's going to run, and those assumptions, those environmental assumptions are no longer true because at the time that you migrate into microservices, very likely you are migrating your delivery infrastructure and when you're going to run. You're probably going to cloud or going to PaaS. So at the time you wrote the previous generation, you weren't thinking about 12-factor application principles. So how you were reading environment variables, how you were accessing data, all this boilerplate code that we write are tightly coupled to how we ran that application before. So if your code is just it's a simple web application or a simple application and doesn't have a lot of intellectual property or kind of complex algorithms, it doesn't do image recognition, probably those boilerplate codes can be rewritten and less costly to do that. And the code you can use or the tool you can use to help you make a judgment call whether you should reuse the code or not is code toxicity analysis tools to see how toxic or what's the quality of the code that we are investing into Decouple. Number 3, so what shall we decouple? Of course, we decouple something that matters. I heard this kind of quote from Neil Ford, and he might have been quoted from someone else, that kind of evolving architecture and decoupling monolith is less like playing with Lego pieces and more like organ surgery. And if anybody in the crowd, the people who put their hands up about decoupling kind of services out of a monolith, they probably know what I mean by that. The cost is quite high, so if you want to choose a capability to decouple, choose the one that is getting a lot of love. The one that is lively, is being changed and accessed by users and has high value. How can you find that out? Well, we can use social code analysis tools like CodeScene to see the pattern of the change, who's touching the code, how often it's being changed. You kind of need to also be careful with filtering out the noise. I've seen a lot of build systems that kind of as you commit the code, they run a trigger to kind of touch some files that has nothing to really to do with the high value change. So you want to kind of filter out those ones. All right, number 4. How should we decouple capabilities? So one of the characteristics behind microservices is that we can release, we can release the service independently of each other. And we know that kind of our monolith, internally, it has still these layers of kind of user interface and domain services and kind of data layer. And very often, when we start getting capabilities out of the monolith, we find it very difficult to change maybe the facade or the interface to that capability. Why? Because we have old applications and UIs accessing the monolith. That's hard. We maybe just extract some backend services. We would never kind of extract the data because the data is shared, who knows who's touching it, so we can't do that. So I will really encourage you to decouple, kind of, slice through your capability from the interface that it exposes to other applications, to its domain implementation and the data or communication with downstream services. Kind of get a vertical slice of that to be able to completely get the benefit of independent releasability. So when we talked about the anti-patterns that we often see, data often never gets decoupled. And if you really find it difficult at the time, I've experienced this. We have release capabilities that we couldn't change the interface, and it's still old, clients were touching the old monolith. I would probably be cautious about doing decoupling without those kind of vertical slicing. Number 5. Minimize dependency back into the monolith. So why are we migrating from monolith to a microsystem ecosystem? Because changing monolith is bloody hard. It costs a lot and it's painful. So if we extract services in a way that our core capabilities are still locked up inside the monolith, we will be going back probably to the monolith to make changes. So that my advice is, if you really have gone through different trade-offs to pick the service and you go, oh, between this service and A and B, I don't know which one to pick, I would say pick the one that doesn't have dependencies back to the monolith. And if you think about that first tactic that we talked about, take the one which everybody else depends on, and if you do that iteratively, you probably end up with this style where you get a capability out, you redirect your channels to that, and if the monolith has dependency to it, that's okay. But in some cases, this is not possible, right? We still have dependencies back to the monolith. I'll give you an example. We were working on a project where there was a lot of demand from our kind of business side to change. It was a retail system to change the buy path, how we kind of convert customers, potential customers to real customers. They go from their cart and browsing products to actually making a purchase. And that's an area, the buy service, if you think about it, needed a lot of change. And we decided, okay, that's the one we take out. But the buy service had dependencies to offers, how we give discount to the customers and offers. And that was still stuck in the monolith. And because of the release pressure and the prioritization coming from the business, we weren't really able to take the offer service out and then buy. So we decided to invest a little bit in the monolith, build APIs, and expose APIs out of the monolith, offer APIs out of the monolith, and take the buy out. But rationally, we probably should have done it the other way around. And if you have a dependency back to the monolith, to its API, build an anti-corruption layer in your service so that in future, it can talk to a different service, different independent APIs. Number 6, go macro then micro. I actually stole this from Sam. Doesn't matter. So it's, the early days of microservices, we got really excited. So we started with kind of this whiteboard academic exercise of what are the right boundaries and seams for, decoupling our services. And we brought those, kind of data-centric view of the world and practices around building rational databases. And we designed this well-normalized, kind of set of microservices around the data, and really tiny services. But that can be quite painful if you're not operationally ready to handle a large number of services. So my suggestion would be, if you're starting, think about larger kind of services that it may contain a few different smaller ones, and in future you can kind of decouple them. I had someone coming to me and asking, well, we had this capability, we pulled it out, we made 2 different services, and now we realize that, we decoupled across a transactional boundary, and now we have to deal with distributed transactions, and we have to kind of invest a lot of effort into that, or maybe just to stitch the services back together. A good example of that is a company called Stripe. They provide credit card access APIs to retailers, and what they've decided is that a certain path within their credit card payment process, it has to be an atomic transaction. I've decided that that's not going to be a microsystem. That's going to be kind of a macro service or a monolith, and that's perfectly fine. However, if you feel like, okay, I'm not operationally ready, I'm going to try to build kind of a macro service, but I know that logically there are different resources here, you can still use hypermedia and hyperlink to those services that they happen to hit the same kind of endpoint in terms of the process, and in future kind of decouple those into separate physical services, and your client won't get affected. And that's the promise of kind of RESTful services with hypermedia. The final one, migrate in atomic steps of architecture evolution. And if you want to take one thing away from this talk, I really want it to be this. When I kind of came to this conclusion, I got so excited, and maybe it's obvious to everyone, but it wasn't really obvious to me. And what's behind this technique is the acceptance that when we evolve our systems, we usually get worse before we get better. And in a lot of times, there is this myth that we can evolve our systems and move away from legacy to microservices before we run out of money or end of our life. And that's seriously a myth, and that's why enterprises today are such a mess, because they've gone through so many rounds of architectural evolution, but in every round, they haven't really got to a better place. They got into a messier place. So you have 3 systems does the same thing, 5 system keeps customer information that nobody can get access to. So what shall we do? I think we should plan our architectural releases in a way that we don't finish that evolutionary step until we are at least in a little bit of a better place. Let me give you an example. We were building a authentication service out of this monolithic retail e-commerce application. So, and it was the first service. We just want to get a feel for what it's like to build a service in this new world. So we built this new auth-based kind of authentication service, and we created a path within the monolith so that the new clients can touch the monolith and then go through this new path of authentication to the authentication service. And we didn't really change the existing clients. So what we ended up with was 2 execution paths, a switch somewhere in the code that said, oh, if you're coming through this, OAuth-based authentication, go to this service, and if you're still using the session-based authentication, go to this other path. And our intention behind doing that evolution was, in the first place, get speed of delivery. Have we really got closer to that state? Is it faster to implement now in this world? The next poor soul who comes across this code is going to probably spend more time to figure out how the heck the system works. So we actually devolved and evolved. We kind of, if you look at that diagram, and that's what this diagram tries to show, if on the x-axis you have the time as you go through evolution of your architecture, and your y-axis is your fitness function, which shows how far you are in your architecture from the target objective of that architecture, we got a little bit worse. That was the bottom of that dip. The hockey stick is where we had both solutions active, the old way of doing things and the new, and the new way. And if we continued that project to the point that we retired the old clients, so they use the new authentication, and retired the code, then we are in a better place. So sometimes this step of evolution is a tiny step, and sometimes it's a giant leap. So I really want you to think about, when you're designing your projects and allocating budget, where to go to try this. And the unit of migration can be maybe described as decouple, redirect clients to the new service, and retire. And to be honest, I played with this idea of, why do I need to waste my time, retire old code? Are we going to just get rid of this monolith anyway and just leave dead code in there, nobody gonna access it? But the reality is that monolith is gonna probably stay around in one shape or form after I've gone. Not from this world, hopefully, but from the company. So it's better to go through those kind of atomic steps of evolution. Quick recap: decouple the most constraining factor early, decouple capability, not code, sometimes code if you have high IP in your code. Decouple what matters, what gets a lot of love and change. Decouple vertically, think about the data first. Minimize dependencies back to the monolith, and if you do expose APIs, go macro first, then micro, and most definitely evolve in these atomic steps towards evolution. So shout what number is the best one. I'm just waking people up now. 2. 2, 5. It's all over the place. 5. Great. Okay, good. There were some good ones in there. At least somebody responded. All right. This yellow should wake you up now. Okay. Are we ready for the climb? Yes? Good. I've got a yes. Yes, so this, I told you, it's going to be a long journey and hard one. And it's going to take a little time to change organizations and change the backbone of infrastructure where you run microservices. But I guess my advice is just while you are going through that hard climb, just stop for a moment, take a look, and enjoy the view that how far you've come. And then continue. Have a bit of fun. All right, so this is going to be a jam-packed slide. I'm going to go up a little bit and look at the big picture. We were deep down in the monolith kind of decomposition. Martin, sitting here, I hope I have quoted you correctly. The only thing a big bang architecture guarantees is a big bang. So from what I've said so far, you must have realized that I've taken a very evolutionary approach to changing architecture, kind of a long transition or transformation that needs to happen. So what can we do to go the long way? Number 1, start with a clear outcome and intention behind your architectural change. Why are you evolving your architecture? Where are you heading? Rebecca Parsons and Neil Ford, both from Thoughtworks, they have a book actually coming up called about evolutionary architectures like microsystems that evolve. They can evolve and change. And what they talk about in terms of the target state of your architecture is a set of capabilities. And a way maybe you can visualize it for yourself is the spider graph of all those abilities that matter to you, and that's where you want to evolve your architecture to in terms of outcome. A lot of our clients, they say, we want to innovate, we want to experiment faster. Well, that's probably an axis on that radar. Some people care about auditability and security or throughput. Whatever these kind of architectural facets or abilities are, let's put them down and give them a score so that we can measure and we can use that as a way of testing that fitness function. They use the analogy of genetic algorithms, fitness function, that how far as you go through these mutations you are from that target state. So once your intention is clear, and I just want to say, please don't put buzzword compliance on that radar. It doesn't belong there. It's very hard to test that. Once you've got your kind of picture of the world in terms of outcome, then you're going through a series of, okay, I'm going to hypothesize, if I make this change, I'm going to evolve to a better place, closer to my outcome. But how are you going to actually measure that? So it's really important to, as we go through changes, we have a way of measuring, are we going closer or are we going further away from the evolution target? And some of you might argue, and I probably did that as well, how am I going to measure the impact of my architectural change? Up here, I have a measure of success that I'm going to innovate and create kind of innovative solutions for my user. And down here, I'm doing architectural change. So how I'm going to actually create a measure of success? And that's where you can kind of get creative and think about leading indicators that show that you're kind of moving towards that outcome and the measure of success. So for instance, if you are building a platform of APIs and services for innovation, what you can measure is a number of applications you have built with the APIs, the number of products you have been able to change if you were, the objective was creating new products through your APIs, how quickly you've been able to change and create new APIs. So those are the leading indicators that should be fairly easy to measure along the way. Does that make sense? A few nuts, okay. It's hard, and to be honest, we are forcing ourselves right now as part of the digital platform strategy because we think about kind of long-term evolution while we're doing these small steps, and the promise that we have to our clients is that we're going to show you outcome along the way. So we are taking a moment and think about all these leading indicators that we have to kind of show progress and keep ourselves honest to the strategy that we're building. The third one is enable your teams with self-service platform. I've kind of tried to cover this. It's probably a talk in itself, but think of Amazon, think of Google Cloud, think of companies that are able to accelerate because they invest in building their core capabilities, their foundational capabilities as self-serve kind of APIs. So you don't have to hold hands if somebody wants to use the API you created, or somebody doesn't need to create a backlog item for you to create another feature for them. It's easy, and with less friction, we can kind of consume the APIs. I love this one. There is a quote that says, there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs. And so as microservices, it's not a silver bullet. It's a set of trade-offs that you have to make as you go. For instance, Martin yesterday in his keynote speech referred to using event-based systems for perhaps synchronizing data or keeping data, the two different data sources. Synchronization of that and eventual consistency is a trade-off that now we need to have a solution for. So as you go through this evolution, you have to make a lot of trade-offs. And a good resource to go to is Chris Richardson's pattern languages, where he describes every decision that you make with a pattern, and every pattern creates a new set of problems that you need to trade off and answer with another pattern. And it's really good to be explicit about the trade-offs that you make and use a technique like architecture decision records from Michael Niger to document as not only what trade-offs you're making, but why you're making those trade-offs. So, and the trade-offs could be, do I need to use a different, do I need to use events or RESTful APIs, or the trade-off might be, do I need to reuse code or rewrite? And we touched on that in those practices with code toxicity and the entropy of the code change. You can make that decision. Or the trade-off might be, should I actually build this service? This likes a utility common service I can get open source, or shall I invest in building it myself because it seems strategic, it seems unique to my business? So be very kind of explicit about those trade-offs. And finally, just scratching the surface here, organizational alignment absolutely must be there. And I'm not only talking about forming teams around your services. I'm talking about how you're actually allocating budget. How does the money flow in your organization? Because how the money gets allocated leads to how we measure success, and what we measure leads to how people behave. And if you go back to the measurements of success that we talked about on the hypothesis side, is that if you think about kind of why you make an architectural change, what makes it to be successful, then you can kind of justify the allocation of money and budget towards that. So there is a whole organizational and portfolio management piece to microservices, at least in large organizations. Okay, but that's, as Lao Tzu says, the father of Taoism, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with one step. And then add to that, and a dream. And if you need help along the way, don't hesitate to contact us at Thoughtworks. Thank you.
Okay, we've got some time for questions. Using REST usually makes us create microservices based on the data, not the business. How do you deal with that?
Well, instead of starting bottom up, I don't think it's really the REST fault, but probably it's the way we think about the world. It's kind of bottom up from the data. I would say think about, there are exercises like event storming. When you think about your customer, your journeys within the application and the events that get generated, you think about kind of the interaction of the user. So at a higher level, so instead of designing the services bottom up, design the services top down, and think about all the capabilities that get touched as the customer goes through a journey interacting with your system, or think about the events that get generated as the customer tries the system and find the ones that kind of belong to a cohesive implementation or a set.
There's another one here. Could you tell us more about how to deal with removing the data layer from the monolith when we don't know exactly who is using it?
I know. You just have to break them. You'll find out when they stop working. I
was really hoping you had an easy answer for that one, because that would have really helped me out as well.
And sometimes we don't care. Like, maybe nobody uses those applications. Yeah.
This is actually a really good one. Is there a body of resources for monolith to microservices conversions, e.g. a collection of case studies, so that we are not reinventing the wheel every time we need to tackle a monolith across companies?
I was just trying to convince Martin to build one. Is there a body of resources? A good point. I think we should all collectively start putting one together. I don't know of any. Yeah?
Is that like a collection of resources on GitHub about monolith? Oh, okay. Just type awesome into awesome into Google, and that's going to sort it out. Is it, Daniel? Awesome microservices. Okay, so yeah, we should do that. Randy, if you also did share some of the, he shared about 3 or 4 examples on the previous talk, but that's a really good idea.
I think it's a good idea.
If only some kind of multinational consultancy organization had resources for this sort of stuff. Yeah. There we go. Okay, we've solved that problem. There's now a question here about the challenges in Northern Ireland and the Middle East. So if we can solve those ones as well, that'll be easy. Probably got time for one more question. Actually, in the evolution you had showed, how long are microservices to stay? So I guess that's the question saying, you know, if this is an evolution, are microservices maybe the destination, or are they just a stepping stone on the way to something else?
I don't know. Maybe nanoservices are on the horizon. Well, right now, that's where we are striving to get to. And from all the signals that we can see, it's even if it's a stepping stone, it's a good stepping stone because it's a distributed system. You know, it allows change, and it has that nature of composability and changeability, so that you can change implementations behind the scenes. So I feel even if it's a good question. Even if it's a stepping stone, it should be easier to move from microservices forward.
Well, we had another question coming in. One of the advantages of microservices is to independently scale functionality. Should performance be a criteria for knowing what to split first? So, the example, I need to scale my whole monolith for this functionality, so is this a candidate to split first?
Right. So decide as what capability you pull out based off of the scale. That might be the need. It is one of the characteristics of microservices, but it's not necessarily the main driver for many of our clients. We had a client where a lot of the capabilities didn't need to scale out so much because they weren't, for instance, CPU intensive, or they weren't getting a high throughput access. But we had one capability in the middle of that architecture. It was the pricing engine, which calculates the pricing. That was really high, kind of CPU intensive, and that was a driver for pulling that one out and scaling. But absolutely, I think it's in the list of the things that you want to pick out. If you have a component that requires that scalability, you definitely want to get that out. Thank you. There was a number 8 added to the list.
Okay. I think maybe one last question, and then we'll call time. You told us not to migrate our auth system at the beginning, but should we prepare ourselves now to do that in the future? And how would we identify when the right time is to make that change?
If you are deploying a service, build, test, release, deploy, without finding yourself entangled in a large integration environment, and it's a painless exercise, then it's time to, you know, kind of go from 2 services to 4 services. So I think that itself is an evolution, that as you build services, you build the operational infrastructure and your culture and how you test and how you build pipelines along the way. And once it feels painless, then we kind of start growing the number of services.
Okay. I hope you join with me with thanking Zhamak for a great talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
Did you give